receptive of all. And Aristotle, the ideal of a life which embraces every variety of experience. There is some intimation of this ideal in the lust for adventure which motivates.
Okay, I think we're good. There is some intimation of this ideal in the lust for adventure which motivates Odysseus and his men. Dante, in fact, finds the secret of his character and the ardor of Odysseus, quote, to become experienced of the world and of the vices of men and of their virtue, which leads him to pursue virtue and knowledge, even to the point of his mad flight. There is some suggestion of this ideal of experience in the unbounded vitality of Gargantua and Pantagruel, and in the enterprise of the wife of Bath in Chaucer's tale. But the great poetic expression of this ideal is written in Faust. In the words of experience, Mephistopheles opens to the man who has wagered his soul for one ultimately satisfying moment. Whatever to all mankind is assured, I, in my inmost being, will enjoy and know. Seize with my soul the highest and most deep. Men's weal and woe upon my bosom heap, and thus this self of mine to all their selves expanded, like them I too at last be stranded. The basic issue concerning the role of experience in the origin of knowledge, especially the organized knowledge of the arts and sciences, turns on whether it is the source or only a source. It is rarely, if ever, supposed that nothing can be learned from experience, or that everything worth learning can come to be known entirely apart from experience. During the early centuries of Christianity, devoutly religious men preached that God had revealed to man all he needs to know in order to live well and be saved. But this extreme position rejects the constructions of reason as well as the materials of experience. Among philosophers and scientists concerned with what man can learn by the exercise of his own powers, the controversy over experience usually involves a distinction between the senses and the reason or intellect. As indicated in the chapters on idea, mind, and sense, whether the distinction can be visibly made is itself a major issue in the tradition of the great books. Those who make it, however, tend to regard experience as something which results from the activity of the senses. For them, the problem is whether our ideas, the general notions or concepts that enter into our scientific judgments and reasoning, come from sense experience, which either is or originates from the perception of particulars. The contrast between the particular and the universal, between precepts, sense impression, or concrete image on the one hand, and concept or abstract idea on the other, lies at the heart of the problem. One possibility is that the mind, by processes of abstraction or induction, somehow draws all its concepts and generalizations from experience. Aquinas is representative of this view. He adopts Aristotle's notion that the intellect is, quote, like a tablet on which nothing is written. The tabula rasa depends upon the senses and the imagination for the materials out of which concepts are formed. For the intellect to understand actually, Aquinas writes, not only when it acquires new knowledge, but also when it uses knowledge already acquired, there is need for the act of the imagination and of the other powers. Without experience, the mind would remain empty. But experience itself does not fill the intellect with ideas. The activity of the sensitive faculty is not by itself the cause of knowledge. The perceptions and images furnished by sense experience, Aquinas writes, need to be made actually intelligible, and this requires the activity of the intellect, not merely its passivity in receiving impressions from experience. For this reason, he concludes, it cannot be said that sensitive knowledge is the total and perfect cause of intellectual knowledge, but rather that it is, in a way, the material cause. Although experience is the indispensable source of the materials on which the intellect actively works, knowledge worthy of the name of science or of art does not come from experience alone. Thus we see that those who, like Aquinas, affirm that there is nothing in the intellect which was not previously in the senses, do not mean to imply that the materials of sense experience reach the intellect untransformed. On the contrary, the primary contribution of the intellect is the translation of experienced particulars into universal notions. Nor do those who, like Bacon, affirm that the principles of knowledge are obtained by induction from experience necessarily imply that all knowledge is directly drawn from experience, to the extent that deductive reasoning is a way of learning new truths. The truths thus learned derive from experience only indirectly. Their direct source is truths already known, which must in turn have come from experience by induction. Harvey criticizes those who misconceive the part which reason should play in relation to the senses. In the field of his own inquiries, some weak and inexperienced persons, he writes, vainly seek by dialectics and far-fetched arguments either to upset or establish things that are only to be founded on anatomical demonstration and believed on the evidence of the senses. How difficult it is, he continues, to teach those who have no experience the things of which they have not any knowledge by their senses. As in geometry, so in all the sciences, according to Harvey, it is the business of reason, quote, from things sensible to make rational demonstration of the things that are not sensible, to render credible or certain things abstruse and beyond sense from things more manifest and better known. Science depends upon both reason and sense, but sense, not reason, is the ultimate arbiter of what can be accepted as true. To test whether anything has been well or ill advanced, to ascertain whether some falsehood does not lurk under a proposition, it is imperative on us, Harvey declares, to bring it to the proof of sense, and to admit or reject it on the decision of sense. The foregoing views are not a necessary consequence of the distinction between the faculties of sense and reason. The theory of innate ideas presents another possibility. As expressed by Descartes, for example, this theory holds that There are, quote, purely intellectual ideas, which our understanding apprehends by means of certain inborn light. Hence it would seem that experience can be dispensed with, except for its value in dealing with particulars. But for most of the writers who take this view, experience, in addition to providing acquaintance with particulars, acts as the stimulus or the occasion for the development of the seeds of knowledge implanted in the mind at birth. Although he rests his metaphysics on the innate ideas of self and God, Descartes, who appeals to experimental knowledge in the sphere of natural science. Descartes also appeals to experimental knowledge in the sphere of natural science. To answer such a question as, what is the nature of the magnet? Magnets. The inquirer must first collect all the observation with which experience can supply him about this stone, and from these he will next try to deduce its character. Collecting magnets. Just magnets. The extreme position which denies any role to experience can be taken only by those who think that the growth of actual knowledge from innate ideas requires no outside impetus, and perhaps also by those who make ideas the objects of the mind's intuitive apprehension. It is questionable whether anyone goes to this extreme without the qualification that, for particulars at least, sense experience is knowledge. The other extreme, that experience is the only source of knowledge, is approached by those who deny the distinction in faculties and substitute for the duality of sense and reason, each with its characteristic contribution to human knowledge, a distinction between the function of perceiving and that of reworking the received materials, though in different ways. Hobbes, Locke, Berkeley, and Hume all appear to take this position. They represent, according to James, the empirical school in psychology. He tries to summarize their view by saying that, quote, if all the connections among ideas in the mind could be interpreted as so many combinations of sense data wrought into fixity, then experience, in the common and legitimate sense of the word, would be the sole fashioner of the mind. If, in other words, all that is done with the sensations, impressions, or ideas, whatever term is used for the original data of experience, consists in their reproduction by memory and imagination, and their comparison, combination, and connection in various ways to produce complex ideas, judgments, and trains of reasoning, then the entire content of human knowledge can be reduced to elements derived exclusively from experience. Whether this position is taken with or without qualification depends on the disposition that is made of the problem of universals or abstractions, which is more fully discussed in the chapters on idea, sense, and universal. Locke's treatment of abstract ideas and the special consideration given by Hume to the concepts of mathematics suggests that there are kinds of aspects of knowledge which cannot be accounted for by reduction or experience. Both men introduce a certain qualification upon their empiricism. However slight that may be, it does not appear in Hobbes and Berkeley, for they completely deny the existence of abstract or universal notions in the mind. If abstract, universal, or general applies to names alone, then the mind or understanding adds nothing to and does not radically transform the materials of experience. The controversy concerning experience and knowledge can also be stated in terms of the opposition between the a priori and the a posteriori. These terms are sometimes used to signify what is possessed before and what comes after or from experience, and sometimes they are used to indicate, without reference to the time order, what is independent of and what is dependent upon experience. The distinction between the a priori and the a posteriori is not made in the same way with respect to propositions or judgments and with respect to reasoning or inference. The distinction and its significance for science and philosophy are discussed in the chapters on judgment and reasoning. It is sufficient here to point out that an a priori judgment is not determined by experience, nor does it need empirical verification. It might at first be supposed that those who agree in thinking that experience is just one, not the only, source of knowledge, would also agree that some judgments, especially the basic propositions of science, are a priori. But this does not appear to be the case. Bacon, for example, like Aristotle, holds that the principles of the various sciences are derived by induction from experience. There are and can exist, he writes, but two ways of investigating and discovering truth. The one hurries on rapidly from the senses and particulars to the most general axioms, and from them, as principles and their supposed indisputable truth, derives and discovers the intermediate axioms. The other constructs its axioms from the senses and particulars by ascending continually and gradually, till it finally arrives at the most general axioms. All axioms on this view are a posteriori propositions. Descartes and Kant, while differing in the terms of their analysis, think, as we have seen, that the mind itself provides the ground for certain judgments, which are therefore a priori. It does not even seem to be the case that those who make experience the only source of knowledge regard all propositions as a posteriori. Hume's treatment of mathematical propositions and James's treatment of axioms, or necessary truths, seem to be the exceptions here. There is still another way in which the issue can be stated. The question is whether human knowledge extends to objects beyond experience, to things or beings which are not sensible and which transcend all possible experience. Again, it might be supposed that those who take an a posteriori view of the origin of knowledge would also limit apprehension to things experienceable. But Aristotle and Aquinas seem to say that the origin of knowledge from experience does not restrict the knowledge to things capable of being experienced. Aquinas cites Aristotle's work on the heavens to show that, quote, we may have a scientific knowledge of things we cannot experience. By way of negation and by their relation to material things. He would hold what is true of astronomy to be even more the case in metaphysics and theology. Even though all our concepts are abstracted from experience, we can, by means of them, reach beyond the sensible world to purely intelligible realities, to immaterial and non-sensible beings, or aspects of being. Locke, who may be thought even more emphatic than Aristotle or Aquinas in his insistence on the empirical origin of knowledge, goes as far as they do in affirming man's knowledge of God and the soul. Hume, in contrast, holds that knowledge may go beyond experience only if it is knowledge of the relation of our ideas, as exemplified in the science of mathematics. Precisely because mathematics is not knowledge of matters or fact of real existence, precisely because mathematics is not knowledge of matters of fact or real existence, its propositions are, according to Hume, discoverable by mere operation of thought, without dependence on what is anywhere existent in the universe. But with regard to matters of fact, Hume thinks that experience is our only guide. Any science which claims to be knowledge of reality or existence rather than of the relations between ideas is thus limited to the realm of experienceable objects, according as the objects of a science fall within experience. So also must its conclusions be verified by reference to experience. Experience is the ultimate test of what truth there is in the propositions of natural science. Only the propositions of mathematics can have a validity which does not require empirical verification. By these criteria, Hume challenges the validity of metaphysics or natural theology. Such disciplines claim to be knowledge of real existences, but their objects are not experienceable, and their conclusions cannot be empirically verified. The existence of God and the immortality of the soul may be objects of faith, but they are not verifiable conclusions of science. Nor, for that matter, can metaphysics give us scientific knowledge of the ultimate constitution of the physical world, if that involves knowledge of substances and causes which lie behind the phenomena and outside of experience. All the philosophy in the world, Hume writes, and all the religion will never be able to carry us beyond the usual course of experience. Kant, like Hume, limits theoretic knowledge to mathematics and the study of nature. A metaphysics which pretends to know objects outside the phenomenal order cannot be defended. The understanding has no power to decide, he writes, whether other perceptions besides those which belong to the total or of our possible experience in brackets exist, and consequently whether some other sphere of matter exists. What transcends all possible experience, in other words, cannot be known, at least not in the manner of the speculative sciences. Only the moral sciences, proceeding in a different fashion, have access to the realm of the supra-sensible. Kant's position seems to resemble Hume's, but it involves a quite different conception of mathematics and natural science, especially the latter, which Kant divides into pure and empirical physics. Kant identifies pure physic with the, quote, metaphysic of nature, in distinction from the metaphysic of morals, the one a theoretic, the other of practical science. For Kant, the principles of both mathematics and pure physics are a priori rather than a posteriori. Posteriori. The objects of both are objects of actual or possible experience. So again, this is a philosophical term being discussed. Not so much the traditional self-help concept of experience, but more what the idea of experience is in terms of how it relates to axioms, the quest for truth, which apparently is futile, but they still keep doing it. In the classification of sciences, the natural sciences are usually set apart from mathematics, as well as from metaphysics, by being called empirical or experimental. These names signify not merely the inductive method by which the knowledge is obtained from experience, they also imply that hypotheses, however formulated, and conclusions, however reached, must be verified by the facts of experience. Newton states it as a rule of reasoning in experimental philosophy that we are to look upon propositions inferred by general induction from phenomena as accurately or very nearly true, notwithstanding any contrary hypotheses that may be imagined, till such time as other phenomena occur, by which they may either be made more accurate or liable to exceptions. It's very reasonable. In similar tenor, Lavoisier says that we ought, in every instance, to submit our reasoning to the test of experiment, and never to search for truth, but by the natural road of experiment and observation. The two words, empirical and experimental, should not, however, be used interchangeably. No science can be experimental without being empirical, but as the chapter on astronomy indicates, the converse does not appear to be true. There seems to be three different types of experience from which knowledge can be derived. One, the ordinary everyday experiences which men accumulate without making any special effort to investigate, explore, or test. Two, the special data of experience which men collect by undertaking methodical research and making scientific observations, with or without apparatus. And three, experiences artificially produced by men who exercise control over the phenomena and with respect to which the observer himself determines the conditions of his experience. Those experiences which are used to prove a scientific truth, James writes, are for the most part artificial experiences of the laboratory, gained after the truth itself has been conjectured. Of these three, only the last is an experimental experience. The first type of experience may be employed by the scientist, but it is seldom sufficient or reliable enough for his purposes. The distinction between the empirical sciences which are and those which are not experimental turns on the differences between the second and third types. It is not always possible for the scientist to perform experiments, as, for example, in astronomy, where the phenomena can be methodically observed and exactly recorded, but cannot be manipulated or controlled. Among the great books of natural science, the biological writings of Hippocrates, Aristotle, Galen, and Darwin, the astronomical works of Ptolemy, Copernicus, Kepler, and Newton, and the clinical studies of Freud are examples of scientific works which are more or less empirical, but not experimental. In contrast, Galileo's two new sciences, Newton's optics, Harvey's motion of the heart and blood, Lavoisier's elements of chemistry, and Faraday's experimental researches in electricity, represent empirical science which has recourse to experimentation at crucial points. On the side of their production, experiments are like inventions. They do not happen by chance or without the invention of art. They are usually performed under carefully controlled conditions and by means of apparatus artfully contrived. This explains the interplay between technology and experimental science. Progress in each occasions progress in the other. On the side of their utility, experiments seem to serve three different, though related, purposes in scientific work. In those branches of physics which are both mathematical and experimental, the experiment enables the scientist to make exact measurements on the phenomena and so determine whether one or another mathematical formulations fits the observable facts of nature. Investigating accelerated motion Galileo seeks not only to demonstrate its definition and its properties, but also to show that experimental results agree with and exactly correspond with those properties which have been, one after another, demonstrated by us. The experiment of the inclined plane yields measurements which exemplify those ratios between space and time that are determined by one rather than by another mathematical definition of the acceleration of a freely falling body. The experiment is thus used to decide between two competing mathematical theories, choosing that one, quote, best fitting natural phenomena. In those sciences, Galileo writes, in which mathematical demonstrations are applied to natural phenomena, the principles once established by well-chosen experiments become the foundation of the entire superstructure. Concerning with the phenomena of heat, Fourier makes the same point concerning the relation of mathematics and experiments. Mathematical analysis, he says, can deduce from general and simple phenomena the expression of the laws of nature, but the special application of these laws to very complex effects demands a long series of exact observations from which experiments are needed. In addition to testing hypotheses and providing measurements whereby mathematical formulations can be applied to nature, experiments function as the source of inductions. A crucial experiment constitutes a single clear case from which a generalization can be drawn that is applicable to all cases. Newton's optical experiments are of this sort. He calls this use of experiments, quote, the method of analysis. It consists in, quote, making experiments and observations, and in drawing general conclusions from them by induction. And although the arguing from experiments and observations by induction be no demonstration of general conclusions, yet it is the best way of arguing which the nature of things admits of. A third use for experiments is in the exploration of new fields of phenomena for purposes of discovery rather than of induction or verification. Hypotheses may result from such explorations, but in the first instance, the experimentation may be undertaken without the guidance of hypotheses. This employment of experimental technique is illustrated by Faraday's remark that, quote, the science of electricity is in that state in which every part of it requires experimental investigation, not merely for the discovery of new effects, but what is just now of far more importance, the development of the means by which the old effects are produced. Experimental exploration, apart from the direction of hypotheses, seems to be a procedure of trial and error. Experimentation, in this sense, reflects what Hippocrates had in mind when he spoke of the experiment perilous. In the work of Hippocrates, at the very beginning of empirical science, recourse to experiment, far from being the most prized technique, signified a lack of scientific knowledge. Only the physician who could not cure the patient by art based on science took the risk of experimenting, of proceeding by trial and error. Yeah, that would suck to have some sort of illness in ancient times. Well, there you have it. Experience sort of relates to mind and reasoning. I think it's important not to lose a sense of the big picture about existence and existing. Not get lost in the trying to understand all the details of the implementation of existence. They're probably not that important. Unless you assume that existence is perfect, in which case you can sort of understand things worth understanding by understanding the particular details of existence. But probably a lot of the times, simple-minded people probably have a better paradigm in terms of what's worth focusing on in your short lifespan. And people who have thought enough to understand it better than anybody else what thinking entails. There's probably better things to think about. That actually do exist, by the way. Odysseus. But I do enjoy reading it's good food for thought. As long as you don't take it too seriously, I think. I'm a Christian, and I doubt I never will be. Simple-minded. The simple idea of looking at a person and saying that person is doing things right. How can I be like that person? And believing that I'm correct in that sort of initial judgment. And not questioning every little detail about my thought process. And letting that be enough to determine the beliefs that I nourish in my mind. What does Christ say about, at some point, said something like, uh, I praise you, Father, Lord in heaven and earth, because you have hidden I thank thee, O Father, Lord of heaven and earth, because thou hast hid these things from the wise and prudent, and hast revealed them unto babes. Why would he say that? It's also a fan of irony? Or were they more deserving in some way? Or is a greater level of beauty about them than the wise and prudent?